You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined by Chris Redfearn of USC and Anthony Orlando of Cal Poly Pomona to discuss their paper, Houston, You Have a Problem, How Large Cities Accommodate More Housing. We talk about why Texas housing markets are catching up to California and what it means for future city growth. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by our super generous Patreon supporters. Thanks infinitely to all the transit planners, bus drivers, advocates, and friends that support the show. To join this merry gang of zoning misfits and transit lovers, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month will get you some stickers and a handwritten note. $10 a month will get you one of our transportation scarves. We appreciate everyone's support over the last year and look forward to sharing more episodes in 2024. That's patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Also, if you want to support the show in other ways, check out the show notes in your podcatcher or go to theoverheadwire.com to find links to our Cars Are Cholesterol merch, our Talking Headways book club shop at bookshop.org, or sign up for a 2-week free trial of our 18-year-old daily newsletter and archive. Thanks for supporting, and this year make sure to listen to this space for opportunities for happy hours, live performances, and updated information on coming attractions. Anthony Orlando and Chris Redfearn, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
Glad to be here.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for being here. Before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourselves? And we'll start with Chris and then go with Anthony.
I'm a professor at USC. I've been teaching there for 24 years now. I got my PhD in economics at Berkeley, and I had started there in operations research and had discovered that I just wasn't that interested in doing operations research stuff. And I walked around campus and found an urban economist named John Quigley. And we had a nice chat about what he was doing. And he said, you should study economics and study cities because there are large, complex systems that never get boring. They're always changing. And so I switched from operations research into economics, got the job at USC, and then fell into the real estate people and have been doing kind of real estate and urban stuff ever since.
Well, I backed into real estate and urban planning and urban economics. My original interest was in finance. That's what I studied in college. And it was the financial crisis and the housing bubble that first got me interested in it. And then I went to get my PhD at USC, where I studied with Chris and the other folks at the Price School. And so now I'm an associate professor of finance, real estate, and law at Cal Poly Pomona. I teach real estate finance, some urban planning and economics classes, and I do research on a variety of housing and real estate issues.
And was this something so Anthony, you just mentioned that you kind of fell into it, but I'm curious if this is something you all somewhat paid attention to when you were younger. I usually ask folks if they were interested in trains or things when they were kids, but housing policy is a little bit different, I think, in that respect.
I was, I think, maybe unusual in that sense because most of the people I know who are in urban fields were interested in cities and transportation from a young age. I grew up in a very rural area, and so I actually didn't give a lot of thought to city issues until I started living in them. Obviously, I became a lot more interested once I went to college. I went to college in Philadelphia, so that was the first big city that I experienced. But it took a while for me to really understand that it was such a complex field that I needed to spend a lot of time to really dig in and understand.
Yeah, on mine, I actually remember the moment I sort of thought of myself as an urbanist. And it was in Chicago. I was at Northwestern, and I had borrowed a friend's motorcycle because I couldn't own my own motorcycle. My dad would kill me for that one, but he would let me borrow it one day. And so I was driving up Lakeshore Drive, and I actually stopped at some point and realized that the skyline was a series of decisions. There was a 40-story office building there, but it could have been 45. Someone chose 40. And for some reason, this light bulb went on. That any one of those buildings could have been a hotel or a restaurant or a multifamily building, whatever. But, someone had made that choice. And then you realize that it was a bunch of decisions behind it. And then at that point, once you start seeing cities as a choice of this series of decisions, it kind of changes the way you think about cities. So they're the outcome of a whole bunch of accumulated decisions over a long period of time. And once you start seeing the world that way, you're kind of a real estate guy.
There's a great Emily Badger article yesterday in the New York Times talking about the congestion pricing discussion that they're having right now and the big decision that didn't happen. And I find that interesting in the context of what you just said, because there's things that cities have done that are big. Obviously, most of the time it's little things that add up, right? But there's also these big decisions that happen over time that make those skylines happen. And so it's really fascinating to hear that from you. So you all wrote a paper, and I really, really appreciate it. Houston, You Have a Problem, How Large Cities Accommodate More Housing. And when I read it, I knew I had to talk to you all about this because it really pulled together a bunch of ideas about things that I had in my mind for a while. But first, I kind of want to place it in context. I'm wondering how your paper is framed by current discussions about housing supply and cost in the United States at the moment.
Yeah, so, for a long time, housing in the United States has basically been a kind of a boring product. It kind of grew house prices kind of grew with inflation over a long period of time. And so as people needed more housing, they would just build more at the periphery. And that's just, we've been doing that for years. And then as we came out of the recession, the Great Recession, 08, 09, and 10, is that ever since then, house prices have risen kind of above inflation. And it's been really broad based. And so where housing bubbles happened in places locally, where there's always been housing bubbles around, Boston and LA have had, Houston's had them in earlier on, those kind of things. But this was a really broad based and persistent high level of inflation in house prices. And I think a lot of people are trying to figure out what's going on with it. And so I think our question was, it's a supply and demand outcome somehow. And so we wanted to sort of focus on the supply side and just ask, like, has it changed? Like, what's different before 2010 and after? And we picked Texas and California because, infamously, I mean, there's lots of things that are similar about them, but they have kind of pro-business versus pro-regulation kind of dichotomy between the two. And that's the way people think about the two places. Is the blue states are heavily regulated, and California is one of these places, and Texas is free reign and pro-business, and you can do whatever you want. And so if that were the case, then house prices in Houston should have kind of stayed right with inflation, right? Because anytime prices rise, you should be able to build more supply. But, from 2014 to 2000, house prices rose in Houston just at the same rate as LA did. And so that's sort of inconsistent with our conventional wisdom about supply. And so we just wanted to study that, and that's where it got started.
I think the other thing that we've thought about from an early point in the research project was that supply had been studied mostly from an aggregate level, and that most of the research that had been done previously was comparing across cities, which we do some of in this paper. But one thing you'll notice that's different about the way we're approaching it from the way a lot of economists have approached it is that we're focusing on every neighborhood within those cities. It's not just how many new units has Houston added and how many new units has Los Angeles added. One of our motivating questions was, where do the new units go? And we hadn't seen a good study that really identifies exactly where, and if there's a trend to why they get built in certain neighborhoods rather than in others, and whether those trends are different across those cities. So we really wanted to break down those aggregate numbers into the neighborhood level. And once we did that, that's where we started to find some really interesting stuff.
I also want to go back in time a little bit. I want to hear a little bit about post-war housing, because I think that time period part of this is really important too.
Yeah. So, after World War II, we know that the country as a whole is very underhoused, right? And so a couple of things happen. One is we have kind of a wealthy, growing economy that has a rising middle class that wants to do more things than just live in tight, constrained housing in urban areas. And so that causes suburbanization to occur. And then the federal government puts in the highway plan that puts highways all over the place and makes land a lot more available and a lot more accessible. And that causes suburbanization to occur. And so we have this huge wave of suburbanization that occurred in the 50s and 60s and through the 70s. And in LA, the city kind of grows up valley by valley by valley. So the San Gabriel Valley fills up at one point, then the San Fernando Valley fills up, and we go out to Santa Clarita out that way. And so that's just the way it fills up. And that's one of the background observations we make in the paper is that when there is housing demand, where do you build it? Well, you build it where land is cheap, right? So that's the obvious thing to do. That's the cheapest way to build a single family detached home, is to find cheap land for it. So you kind of going further and further out. And, at some point, LA taps out. On one side, it's the Pacific Ocean. On the other side, it's the desert. And then we got Camp Pendleton to the south and the north. You just start running these boundaries, you start running out of free land, and then the distances get enormous. And then, you're no longer really part of this metropolitan area if you're 100 miles from downtown. So you start realizing that people don't really want to be that far out, and then they start moving infill, and then the technology starts to change and the dynamics start to change. And that's what we saw in the maps in LA, was that there was still some infill occurring. And we started when ex-urban development occurring at the periphery, at the very far periphery, but the majority of the units were infill. And that's where we sort of saw the pictures in Houston and Dallas and San Antonio, was that this was starting to happen there too. So at some point they had grown wider and wider and wider and bigger and covered lots and lots of single family detached homes in the suburbs and exurbs. And then they kind of started to rotate more towards infill. And that was fun to see in the maps.
Yeah, another way to think about your question is, why don't we build like we used to, which is a question we hear a lot of. And I think it comes back to maybe the most fundamental principle in economics, which is scarcity. In the post-war era, there was a lot more abundant land, and that's why we were able to build in the way that Chris is describing. When you move forward in time, you start to build out the cities. You don't use up all the land, but you start to get to land that's more and more difficult to build on, or further and further away. And so land becomes more scarce. It's not the only reason why it's harder to build than it used to be, but it's a big piece of the puzzle that we don't think has been pointed out quite well enough before this.
Chris, you said far out, and then Anthony, you said further away, but from what?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So we have this agenda around this supply study, right? So it's not one thing. There's a bunch of papers here, but clearly, like, there's land all over the United States that's empty, right? And so being far from what is the material question, right? And I broadly will say amenities. So in the kind of the basic urban model we train urban economists to think is we have the CBD, the central business district, is downtown where all the employment is, and people radiate out from there and commute in. And that's the primary trade-off is between the amount of housing they get and the commute they make. But once you start mixing in all the other amenities like quality of schools, restaurants, retail opportunities, everything, open space, all the things you start counting on. And then the question is, what do people want to pay for these days? I think one of the things that we'd like to do in the future, we haven't certainly not done in this paper, is kind of enumerate where the amenities are, right? I think that would be really fun because, if you think about Las Vegas as being, a completely vibrant city, right? But it's a desert, right? There's no natural amenity. Like there's obviously hiking and beauty, and there's lots of things out there, but there's lots of desert. You'd never start a city there, right? No one would say this is the right place to start a city. There's no water here. There's no infrastructure. Why would you ever start a city there? But Las Vegas starts because of a couple of other historical reasons, and it persists because amenities are there, right? We're actually building a high-speed rail now from Los Angeles to Las Vegas, and it's kind of bizarre when you think about it, right? Why would you want to do that? So you get back to you asked the where from what is from amenities, and then amenities is a very big umbrella, but yeah, that's it.
Now, in the paper, we've got a couple of things that we do just to make it concrete. One is we measure where we call them NNUs in the paper, net new units. So essentially, we're saying where the housing stock is expanding after you account for demolitions and reductions in the housing stock as well. So where do new units get added? And one thing we find is that originally they were getting added further away from the central business district. We know that none of these cities are perfectly monocentric or anything like that, but just as an approximation, we do find that they used to be built further away from the core of the city, and now they're starting to move back further in. And we know that a lot of those amenities are located in the core, like Chris is saying. Another way that we look at it is what's the density of the neighborhoods where the new units are getting located? And it used to be that new units were getting located in very low density neighborhoods where they're not near a lot of other people and a lot of other stuff. And now the average net new unit that's getting added is getting added in much more dense neighborhoods, which suggests there's a lot more infill. And they are probably closer to amenities because they're closer to other people. And that's where the amenities tend to locate. And a lot of this comes back to the broader problem, which I'm sure a lot of people in the audience are aware of. There's a very famous urban economist up at Berkeley, Enrico Moretti, who's done work suggesting that one of the key sources of productivity growth in the United States is agglomeration, is the fact that we locate near each other. So these amenities are not just a source of consumption benefits for us to enjoy, they're also a source of economic growth. That when we're all located near each other, we're much more of an economic powerhouse. And so when you locate new units further away, you're locating them further away from not just amenities that we enjoy, but also from the ability to have high productivity, high wage jobs. And now we're trying to come back closer in, but it's harder to build in those places.
It's interesting. We just had Michael Batty on to talk about his book, The Computable City, and he was talking about how basically early on in computing, they were trying to model cities, right? And they were using the standard model. I think it was von Thunen and his work as the first wave of thinking about cities as, basically you have the center and then they go out from the center to get land and housing and things like that. And I find it interesting that, that was kind of the way that people looked at things. And then now we're trying to put it on its head and think about it a little bit differently. Or is it the same? I'm curious what you all think about that.
I think it's super interesting to think about the cities we've been talking about, because you can talk about Houston in much more detail than I can. But Los Angeles is, if you look at a map of, the first road maps, I got a map of 1918 and 1921, I got a nice road map that I digitized and wrote a paper around. And you can actually predict the employment in Los Angeles now using that map better than you can the current highway system, because the original road systems were meant to connect the centers that were in the region. And that made them more productive, to Anthony's point about agglomeration. It made them more productive because the roads were connected and more people drove back and forth. And once the first highway in LA is between downtown LA and Pasadena. And, once you put that in there, both LA and Pasadena get more productive. And so more people want to be there. And so more development occurs there. And that sort of reinforces these systems. And so the set of amenities around the LA basin are really unevenly distributed, but they're based on some historic pattern that wasn't part of the traditional monocentric model where you here's the CBD and radiate out from there. So it was a CBD when, in 1850, for something. And then it grew larger and larger and enveloped other centers. And now we've got these sort of set of many scattered, kind of broadly all over the region. They're really unevenly distributed. So I think part of the problem with the modeling in cities this way is that you have to start with an uneven starting point. And so the starting point for those modeling gets really tricky.
Well, and if you assume that in a monocentric city, whatever direction you move in, it's going to follow roughly the same pattern, which is that's the idea, right? North, east, south, and west, we kind of collapse it all into one graph and just say distance from the CBD. No matter what distance you're at, this is the type of neighborhood you should have. But look at most cities in America, right? You move west or east or south in Los Angeles, you get very, very different types of neighborhoods. Some of it is because of the way transportation networks were built, like Chris was saying. Some of it is because of racist policies like redlining that were instituted in South LA, but not in Northeast LA. And so suddenly you've got completely different amounts of investment that are going to those different neighborhoods. And even after those redlining policies are outlawed, you have path dependence, right? You can't just rebuild a city from scratch. So what's there helps to determine what winds up going there later on.
It's interesting from a Houston perspective, which is where I grew up, and thinking about places like the Woodlands and how that grew up on the outskirts of the city. George Mitchell bought a bunch of land. He had Ian McHarg come in and design the first segment, and then it grew like gangbusters because there's so much open land. But then later on, ExxonMobil decides to leave downtown Houston and move their headquarters up there. Other places start to move and gravitate in that direction. And the Woodlands is now starting to think of itself more like a CBD or a central amenity to a lot of places around it. And so you have the original Houston, but then you have all of these satellites around it, and similar to LA and what Chris was talking about. But it's interesting to see that in real time and how decisions that businesses make, change how the rest of it, plays out as well. And the decision that TxDOT, for example, makes, widening highways and where they're going to widen highways. I remember when I was a kid, it seemed like Highway 59, which is I think I-59 now, was always under construction. Yeah. And so it just funnel more people from further and further north. And so those decisions play into this as well.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I've just finished reading. I finally finished Power Broker. Right, so I don't know if have you actually read it. I know everyone I know owns it, but no one's finished it.
I have it on audiobook and I still haven't read it. Yeah. I know it because it's just ubiquitous, but
the story, right? And then they build lots of freeways and it changes the landscape. And as a result of that, individual developers make choices about where to build housing, and like the entire landscape changes because of transportation, right? So to your point, they're always you said 59 was always under construction. It's like the more you build it, the more people come. And then it reinforces this. You're never going to alleviate through more freeways, right? That's not going to happen.
I want to get back to that in a little bit. I want to get back to that because I think that's an interesting point, especially about Houston and expansion of 45. And we just had Megan Kimball on to talk about, but we'll get into it in a second.
Yeah.
I want to kind of crystallize what you all are saying in the paper, which is basically, cities accommodate growth by building more housing units on the periphery. Then with that land, quote unquote, runs out, eventually the cheaper land is consumed and developers begin to focus on infill, which is what Anthony was talking about. And then also the number of tracts participating in growth is reduced over time, suggesting the ossification of neighborhoods. So those are the three things that I kind of picked up from the paper, is that like we grow until we can't, we start to do infill, which is more expensive, and then neighborhoods are also ossifying at the same time. I want to talk about that kind of change from the growth on the outside to changing to infill and some of the kind of construction things, because part of the paper that was really interesting to me as well is thinking about construction costs or land costs or the things that make it harder to build after you've run out of land on the periphery to what I would call sprawl.
Yeah. So the reason I'm smiling here is just because this is a big can of worms, right? Like this is, the paper, I think in some ways is very descriptive and very aggregate. In some, we dive in and do this mapping locally, which is, I think, a step in the right direction, but there's still lots of details left to be sorted out here. But I think like a lot of urban and housing economists sort of think about development as a black box. And so, when prices rise, there's a force at work and some atomistic small industry that doesn't have much industrial structural power goes ahead and builds things. And, we get outcomes. But I think Anthony and I both spent enough time with enough actual practitioners to see that the difference between single family detached home construction and multifamily construction and type 1, tall construction are really, really different. And they have different sets of risks and different sets of capital providers and different sets of, they're just different, and they work in these different orbits. And so that's the starting point there, is I think we need to think about differentiating these things. And so what you get with the infill development is that the scale is just gone, right? So with the master plan developers in the periphery, like so much of LA was built by master developers who would tie up 10,000 acres and they would subdivide in phase and they would put in the schools and the infrastructure. And so they had a plan in mind. But, we talked about before about how hard it is to change cities once you build it. But, going back into infill means, finding a 50 by 150 site and then squeezing in on it as much as you can. And that's hard. I mean, it's just super hard from a design perspective. You want to do subterranean parking on a site like that, you lose a bunch of land just to getting it underground or not. That's really expensive, and that makes it more expensive. Like, so all these things change. And one of my students, become a friend. He actually worked on my house with me. He's an infill developer, and he just tells me these horror stories about when you try to do a small site, is you can't get the plumber to park on the project. Like you've got this site, and you want your plumber to drive right up with all his tools and all the piping and all that kind of stuff, and it may not be able to park on the site. He has to park down the street. And so just little things like that make development more complicated. It's an entire headache getting his crew on the site and the materials parked, and in a way that Greenfield never has to do. And with Greenfield, you've got acres of space. You can park anywhere you want and just start tearing up dirt and putting infrastructure in. It's really easy. And when you inherit some other site, you have to go underground and upgrade all the facilities, which is not trivial. And there's a bunch of infrastructure that you have to sort of think about working around, which you don't have to do with Greenfield. And so you just like inherently the entire business model changes in ways. So when we start rotating from ex-urban Greenfield development into infill development, just the level of complexity, cost, time, horizon, risk, all those things get higher. I think part of the reason what we're seeing in the falling elasticities of housing supply is exactly this. It's just harder to do.
And before all of that, you've got to get a parcel that actually works for an infill development like that. And so there's a lot more land assembly that's required for infill development and for multifamily than there is for greenfield and single family. There aren't large parcels just freely available in the city center anymore. You usually have to piece together multiple parcels, and sometimes they're odd shapes and odd sizes. And, there's good work showing that the more land assembly you have to do, the more expensive the development is. And in a place like Los Angeles County, almost half of large developments these days require some form of land assembly, according to the latest studies that we've seen.
We actually look at these sort of, where are there big sites that are heavily amenitized? There are these post-industrial sites, right? So think about the Arts District in Los Angeles, a place that was largely abandoned as manufacturing left California. That's a big site, and it's relatively near lots of amenities, right? There's near downtown, there's near transit, there's lots of things there. So, one of the areas that we've seen a lot of development is in these post-industrial sites, and that's true in Houston. It's true in lots of places is where manufacturing's rotated. But that's a finite number. If you look at the map and sort of how much area is there, there's not much of it. And so we're feeling like the latest splurge in where we're getting units built is we're not getting it built much in the infill. We see like we have lots of fights over infill. It's not a big number. Most of the numbers are still ex-urban, and then we see post-industrial as being a significant channel also. But my big frustration there with the infill stuff is that they build these stumpy buildings. And so this is your chance to build towers. And if you build 4/2s there, you're going to get stuck with 4/2 density, and it's going to take another generation or two to work through and get to a higher density. So there's this kind of interesting story about we're building inelasticity in those places also because we're making it lower density than we ought to.
And related to that, though, you're talking about how the changes happen in these different states. So California versus Texas. And you have California, which hit that edge and started to do more infill early on. And so you have the higher prices. We keep on talking about running out of land, but nobody ever runs out of land. It's just like running out of huge tracts of property for single family home development. But they started that earlier. And then Texas might be hitting this wall soon, too. So that is another part of your paper that I think is really interesting is that, you're basically saying the regulatory environments maybe don't matter as much as we say they do. And Texas is just behind California, and maybe like a place like Las Vegas, which I sent you an article saying Las Vegas is saying that it's going to run out of land in 8 years. Maybe Las Vegas is just behind Texas.
Yeah, and Phoenix is in the same boat too. They're running out of land also. So, I think I don't know, Anthony, I don't know if you want to say we're willing to make a strong statement about this. I think we're suggestive, but we're still working on it. I hate to sound like an economist here, but I think what we're really pushing here is we know that regulation matters at the margin. And so when we know that topography matters at the margin. So the literature has really demonstrated that they're abundantly true. And so the question is that explaining everything? And that's where we are, we're looking at other margins here. In this case, the land assembly story is one of them. And the other thing we haven't really talked about is filtering, right? And so, how did we provide more affordable housing in the past? That's when we were going out of the greenfield. So the lack of the greenfield isn't necessarily a bad thing by itself for other reasons, but that just means that the chain of houses that went from a upper middle class house that was built in the 70s, and then someone left that to go to a bigger house further out, then a bigger house further out, left behind a depreciated house. That's been the primary mechanism for delivering middle-class housing, is that now we have people moving infill. And that's tying this back to the whole story about amenities, is that at some point, people have preferences about what they like. And so at one point, people just wanted a big house away from everybody. Like getting away from noxious downtowns was the primary move after World War II. A lot of downtowns were really industrial and polluted and crowded, and people wanted to get away from that. So we've been suburbanizing for 150 years. But, once you get out far enough out, you got a big enough house and you got those things, you also want some other amenities. And so you want to move back in. I think what we're going to see is this dynamic about where people are on their cycle is that we're going to have land development that is running out. At the same time, people want higher amenities, and both those things are going to work towards more infill.
One way that we kind of visualize that in the paper is we map out what the distribution of neighborhoods looks like over time in these different cities. And it's not surprising that in Los Angeles, you find that the number of neighborhoods that have just a ton of vacant land goes down over time. But the number of neighborhoods in Houston goes down over time too that have a lot of vacant land. And so you're right that it's not like we're filling up all the land. You never fully run out of land in the United States. You can always go further away. But within what we consider to be the metropolitan area where people are willing to commute, the number of neighborhoods where there's a lot of land available has gone down dramatically. And it's really actually quite stunning to see in the Texas cities how the changes in those graphs look a lot like what Los Angeles's graphs look like just a few decades earlier. Now, I don't want to say, and Chris was trying to make this point too, we don't want to say that regulation doesn't matter. It does matter. There's a lot of literature suggesting that it does. It's not surprising. You make it harder to build, you make it more expensive to build, it's going to be more expensive to get housing. But when we first started studying this and we first started presenting some of our findings to other urban economists and planners and policy analysts, maybe about 5 or 6 years ago, one of the first presentations we gave, we went through a list of studies by other economists that looked at the actual impact of land use regulations in different cities. So, for example, if we were to change the zoning in one city to a different type of zoning, how many new units would we actually be adding? And how would that actually impact prices? Economists have been good at studying this, and they found statistically significant effects. But what's the magnitude that we're talking about? We started adding up the magnitudes from their own studies. And what we found is if you change some of these regulations, you don't come anywhere close to adding enough units to actually close the gap in what anybody measures to be the housing shortage that we have in the United States. So it matters. But even if we changed a lot of the regulations that we're worried about, we still don't think that would completely fix the problem. It might not even come close.
Is it a geography issue? I mean, thinking about greenfield properties and building 10,000 single family homes versus building 10,000 properties on a couple of infill parcels, that's a huge difference, especially as what Chris mentioned, like building 4/1s, it doesn't, move the needle really if you're just doing a couple, 20 units here and 20 units there versus like the 10,000 that was built when the neighborhood that I was born and grown up in outside of Houston, which was very colorful on your map in thinking about how the city was expanding their housing stock.
So I'm going to throw out another paper that we're not done yet. I've been working with Casey and John McCormick and a guy named Ryan Aubrey, and they are planning consultant data analytical people. And so they've helped sort of put together some code to scrape data to actually track development in Los Angeles, the city of Los Angeles. And it's been super interesting to watch because it kind of gets to this question about, what happens when you change regulation. So we've been tracking the TOC program. So this is the Los Angeles Transit Oriented Communities Program. And within a certain distance from a qualified transit stop, you can build, by right. There's less regulation there. And what we found is that when you started this program, it created a bunch of interest, right? And there was like, aha, we're going to build all this density around transit, which is what we want. Planners like this. And so as long as we make it by right, we should get a lot of stuff built. And sure enough, we got thousands of applications. And then we got thousands of permits approved. And so we got all these entitled units. And the large majority of them are not getting built. So it's a really interesting dynamic here. It's like there is entitlements and regulation, then there's construction, then there's the market risk, and all these things work together at once. And so there's no magic silver bullet. I think that's one of the things that Anthony and I are kind of keep circling back on is that all these programs, as part of a portfolio of solutions, ADUs, TOC, you have this new ED1 project in LA too. Like they all are going to result in some new units, but they're not going to result in enough. And I think that's the kind of the conversation we're going to kind of reach at the end of our research project at some point, hopefully, is like, what's the right way to organize cities to actually get enough housing? Because I don't see any of these programs as delivering enough. We started writing this paper because we were trying to explain why house prices were high. And at the end of it, you sort of get this conclusion, like it's going to require a lot more of something. And it's not just one thing. And we just need, I mean, the number in LA is like 700,000 additional units. And the TOC program has resulted, I think, in something like 9,000 units getting built. So that's 7 years old now at this point. So it's just, it's
Do you think it's financing? I mean, because, the banks have a certain product that they understand and know, and like single family homes on the periphery is a product that they know and understand. And, infill projects, each one is kind of a one-off special thing. It might be a little different in each instance, but I'm curious if that's part of the problem.
I think capital certainly plays an important role, because if they don't understand it and they perceive risks, they're going to stay away. And so it's going to make it hard to fund things. But I think for the most part, in LA anyways, is that land prices rise. So, if you give someone more power to do something, and I think, we've seen the same thing with the ADU programs, is, you give them more rights to build things, and people just feel wealthier, and then they don't feel like they need to build something.
Yeah.
Remember also that a lot of the things we're talking about make it riskier to build infill and riskier to build multifamily. And the riskier that it is, the higher the expected return that investors are going to have. And so a lot more projects aren't going to pencil. So it becomes a financing problem specifically because there's so many impediments to getting things built. Investors don't want to take on those risks unless they can guarantee pretty high returns. And a lot of projects can't fulfill that.
I want to talk about the ossification question, and I'm wondering if you can kind of explain what the paper says and related to this topic of neighborhoods not changing.
So we found that happening because we did these transition frequencies. We sort of looked at what's the housing density on a census tract basis for these 8 metropolitan areas. And we're doing it again for the nation as a whole right now. But we generally find that once you get to a certain density, you stop building. I mean, not stops, but the participation rate. So the percentage of census tracts that engage in significant amounts of new supply is high earlier in their development, and at one point they reach some density and they stop participating. So once you reach 6 per acre in units or 7 units per acre, something like that, it's just harder to add more stuff. And so in this case, Anthony's exactly right. At that point, if you want to add more, you have to do land assembly, right? So you get that sort of ossification. But the ossification is kind of a bigger issue than that. That's something that Tom Malone and I did a couple of years ago in a paper. And in that one, we just found this remarkable persistence in ranks. And it's interesting because prices would move up and down, and education would move, and we had the race and ethnicity in there also. So we had these things that would change over time, but the ranks would always stay the same. So the persistence was really remarkable. Like Beverly Hills is, amongst the top price markets in LA, but it's always been that way. And so when it's much higher than the median is when people are feeling wealthy and they bid up the price of Beverly Hills. And then when the wealthy don't feel that wealthy, the price comes down, but they don't ever come down lower than Compton, right? So they have this hierarchy. And then so the way I think I was sort of organized, it was that, if you've got a fixed income and you got some things you want to do, you got a wife who is working somewhere and you're working somewhere, and you got kids who have to go to college or school or something, and you pick your location to maximize your bundle, right? You'd love to have more house if you had more money, but you've spent your money on location, right? So you kind of maximize your choice. When you get a raise, what do? Do you try to change your whole neighborhood, or do you move to a different neighborhood that has the bundle? And so what ends up happening is, I think systematically people are constantly rearranging. And when they have shocks to their income, they have more income, they can buy more of the stuff they like, and that includes location as well as house. And so they move to the neighborhood that has their next step of the ladder, or step down the ladder if they go down the ladder. And so the ladders persevere because of this, is that people are making choices to move around the thresholds and the hierarchies, and the hierarchy just kind of persists over time. So gentrification, it's funny because gentrification is sort of the story, and we know it's real. It's just not the norm. Like most neighborhoods are kind of where they were 30, 40 years ago. And the persistence, the rank persistence anyways, is just stunning. It's like 90%. So over 40, 50 years, the ranking, wherever a neighborhood was in 1970, is basically the same as it was in 2020, which I think is kind of amazing. Given all the churning that's occurred in LA, all the change in industry, all the change in people and immigrants, all the groups that have kind of changed and made LA different over the years, the neighborhood ranks are very, very constant. And then once you go to a place that's less dynamic, we studied like Bridgeport, Connecticut, Bridgeport, Connecticut's not changed very much. And the rank persistence there is like 94%, 95%, like very little has changed in Bridgeport over 40 years across the things we measured. But yeah, I think this is, again, kind of a fun phenomenon. Like once you lay out a city and put the highways where it are and put the employment centers where they are and the retail where it is, it takes a lot to dislocate that. And we just don't have shocks like that here in the States.
How much is that a function of the transportation network too? I mean, we laid out cities a certain way early on, the grid network, and then it kind of, LA's a little different, obviously, but a lot of places then they went to the kind of the cul-de-sac method of doing things. And so the thing that came up in my mind when I was reading that was just like, you can change, an inner part of the city. Houston has allowed itself to grow inside the loop very famously. But outside of that, you have these network of roads that really don't maybe facilitate the growth maybe like they might have before. It might also just be a function of distance from amenities like you're talking about. But I'm curious, like what the role the transportation existing might play into that.
No, I think you hit it right in the nose there, which is that's why I think that the map, if you want to study the employment of Los Angeles, you look at a map from 1918 or 1921, because all of those roads were highly, highly functional to connect dense places to other dense places. So that the road went straight from one city to another city. And then the modern highway system was about getting around them, right? So the newer freeway system, like the 15 and 215, which are, newer highways in the LA basin, they don't have as many employment centers on them because they're really designed to go around places. And so the existing nodes of concentration are built there now, and they build around those existing subcenters. We don't have lots of new subcenters.
So another question I have then is about building transportation infrastructure now and what that means if the cities as we see them are going to kind of start to move towards that next generation of growth towards infill and things like that. The highway policies that we have in lots of places, especially in states like Texas, is just continue to widen the highways until you have no more room to widen them anymore, or they're going to keep trying as long as they can. Like I mentioned earlier, we had Megan Kimball on to talk about the freeway fighters that are fighting highways all over the country, and specifically in Texas, in places like Austin and Dallas and Houston as well. And I-45 is getting widened again through downtown Houston, but I really don't understand what the benefit of that is if you're going to not have these flows of people from further and further away continue because you, quote unquote, ran out of land.
Transportation and cities are the same issue, right? I mean, we've been studying cities for a long time, and when transportation costs fall, cities get bigger because it's easier to get access to land, right? So we talked about Robert Moses before, and he built lots of roads, and it made lots of Long Island get developed into housing, right? So when you ask about what the right policy is, this is where we get back to sort of this holistic response. Like, there is no silver bullet, right? Holding everything constant, if you added more freeways, that would help, but we don't hold it constant. Like, as soon as that freeway is there, that makes some other person say, oh, now I can actually drive further away to my house, right? So people respond to these things all the time. I think part of the reason I'm frustrated with a lot of housing policy writ large is that we think about these things in margins as opposed to general equilibrium. My daughter went to Madrid for the spring as a part of her semester abroad. We visited her, and she said, Dad, why can't we have trains like this in LA? Like, you took the train everywhere. It stopped all the time. It ran all the time. It was clean. It was busy all the time. Like, well, it's because they organize it in a way that actually makes it useful, right? And so right now we have this train station we spent, billions of dollars on. We and the rest of the states chipped in to help out with that one. And we didn't build lots of density around all the stations, and we don't operate it in a way that makes it enticing. And so I'm not sure I'm answering your question about like the freeway system, but I feel like the transit system as a whole needs to think about how we're going to use the land uses at every station as part of that solution. And then it becomes really complicated because then you're doing regional planning. I don't know if I have a single answer for this one. It's a much long, maybe a different podcast for you, but like, I think integrating land use and transportation policy seems necessary. And I think having the conversation of what's the right transit system has to be answered in concert with what's the right land use policy.
This is like something that I could go on for like 5 hours talking about this and trying to figure out kind of how transportation and land use intersect so that we could get cheaper housing. There's something that popped up recently that I've brought up on a number of shows, and I think it's just really fascinating. But in South Korea, they have a fertility issue is kind of one of the major discussions that's happening related to them. And one of their suggested solutions is to build 6 new rapid transit lines so that people could go home faster to be at home in the suburbs and have bigger houses and have more kids. There's obviously like lots of different policy ways you could look at that. But I'm thinking about, if we are going to be in the space where the results of your paper tell us something about regions and how they grow and what new era we're going into, what does that mean for like transportation spending? And it doesn't have to be about highways. It could be about rapid transit. It could be about the way that we develop our bus systems, or when those places do change over time and the places that aren't ossifying are actually changing, then how do you serve those places as they become more dense? And maybe the transportation network evolves to be different with them as they change, but that is also more expensive, right? That changes the whole calculus of property taxes and spending and state taxes and what the state will give money to. I mean, right now, Texas, for example, is only giving money to highways. They wouldn't give a red cent to transit. They have to do it all themselves in cities. But it's interesting to think about if you're thinking about trying to figure out how to expand the housing pool so that more people can have affordable housing. what does that mean from a transportation standpoint? Does it mean that if you did, build high-speed rail between Houston and Dallas, that those stations in between would be an open market for the old school of growing greenfield development? Like, it's interesting to think about the policies from a transportation standpoint that would open up your model that you're creating with the paper that you wrote.
Certainly, I think that one way to think about adding more affordable housing is to provide transit to other places and allow amenities to be there as well, right? So if the government, if the public were to provide more amenities in different places, then developers would build around them. But we don't ever talk about things that way. We talk about the public building housing, but the private sector is really good at building housing. We just need to make it possible to happen. Like the story about California Forever, it's a really interesting story about a bunch of billionaires who are going to try to build a brand new city in California with a fresh, clean slate. It's going to be easier to do, and they're going to maximize things. And you're shaking your head already.
I'm shaking my head because you said easier, and I ballot measures are never easy in California.
No, exactly, right. So, but easier in the sense, like, if you could start fresh, you could build a system that would be in concert with the land use instead of doing what we're doing now, which is we've inherited, generations of one type of land use, and we're going to try to shoehorn it into something else. That's kind of super inefficient, right? But I think getting back to like the very first question we kind of started the paper with was, why are house prices high? Amenities play a significant role in this, and so that now that people want more amenities and people are going to build more housing near these amenities, then access to the amenities is really kind of the magic formula, right? And so some combination of where the amenities are and how to get access to them is going to allow people to live better. So I think that if there's a rail line between Dallas and Houston, then stops between that should be in a high speed, should allow access to Houston and Dallas in an easy way, and people could live there and you could have more amenities there. But the thing that we're discovering in LA is that land prices might rise in a way that prevent this, right? So I guess I'm kind of hedging a little bit because I think it takes a much more general equilibrium model to sort of think about these things, as opposed to if everything was constant, yes, that would be true. But somehow there's landowners out there who are going to see the train tracks going that direction. Someone's going to step in and buy a bunch of land and then have higher prices for it. So it's not going to be quite as affordable as before because someone's going to earn a slice along that way.
What's something that you guys go back and forth about?
I think we go back and forth on is how to finish a paper. Like I think that we have 6 or 7 paper ideas that all relate to these things, and they're just not really well compartmentalized into a single idea. And I think that's our frustration, is that we've been talking about this whole set of ideas that overlap, and they do. And so I think when we start talking about what we're going to work on, I'm the king of like starting something, and we have this great conversation about it, and then Anthony will say, "Well, let's get together next week and talk about it," and I'll show up with something else. And so this is what we go back and forth on, is how do you commit to a single idea and finish it? Because I don't know, I think a lot of these ideas are a little bit too complicated for a single paper sometimes.
I think the other thing we go back and forth on is part of the reason why I've been quiet in the second half of this interview, in addition to internet problems. It's solutions. We're great at identifying what the problems are, but these systems are so complex. Every time you think of a solution, you think of winners and losers. Every solution has winners and losers, right? You build something new, there's winners and losers. There's trade-offs to everything, and you heard Chris talk about some of them in his last couple of answers. And so I'm hesitant to say, well, if we build a new transit network, or if we build new housing, or if we do this or that, then I think that'll solve the problem, because it often just creates a whole host of new problems. And it's hard to predict all the different ramifications of any policy you're going to put in place. Now, we are working on new projects where we're going to try to propose solutions, but it's hard. It's hard. I'm always reminded, we have a dear friend who used to teach public policy classes, and he would start every semester by saying to his students, there's only one phrase that you're not allowed to say in this class for the entire semester. You're never allowed to start a sentence with the words, "Why don't we just?" Why don't we just do XYZ? Because why don't we just suggest that there's an easy answer and we're all so dumb we haven't thought of it? And thank goodness you all showed up to tell me what that easy answer is. Assume the low-hanging fruit have been picked. Assume that the problems that remain are the hard problems. Now work forward from that premise, because you're much more likely to find interesting and useful solutions if you don't assume that the solutions
I hope I
are
didn't
easy.
say, why don't we?
No, you didn't. No, I wasn't suggesting that.
I do think it's interesting, going back to that California Forever idea, kind of the back and forth that's happening now with it, because We know some of the folks that are working on it, and they are urbanists. Gabe Metcalf was at Spur for a long time.
And he's fabulous.
I know other folks that are working for that wish not to be named, but that are really good on stuff and have been really good in policy related to San Francisco and other places. But it's really hard because you have the situation where the leader, and I said this in my newsletter this morning, he made a lot of political missteps. And I was trying to compare it to Kathy Hochul and the congestion pricing misstep that was just made on her part for politics reasons. But, he was buying up land in secret. They were suing landowners, saying they were colluding against them for just wondering what the value of their land was worth to them. Kind of a screw you price, as I call it. And then they made all the enviros that might be on their side mad by just, deciding to make everything internal and not having it on the main train line between Sacramento and the Bay Area. And so they're going to be asking the state of California or the county for money for a highway that is going to piss a bunch of people off. And so that goes to the trade-offs, right, that you're talking about, where you want to build this 20 unit an acre new development on a greenfield site. You're going to have to build a coalition that is going to vote for it, right? Which is, I think it's like 68% against now at the moment in terms of the polling. And it's tough when you make the missteps at the beginning. And so we're talking about building new housing. People want new housing, but when you tell them that they're going to get amenities out of this, is it going to be amenities for them? Or is it going to be amenities for somebody else? And so if it's amenities for somebody else, they're probably not going to vote for it or care about it as much. The solar array that they're talking about building, the schools and the housing and stuff, the people that are outside of that, they're like, well, we're already at our schools and we're already at our housing. So, that's not going to make a difference for me. So I find those trade-offs and those discussions interesting, especially from a politics level, thinking about how you're actually going to do it. And it makes it harder to build new housing. And there's other folks who have said on the show, maybe they should have taken that $1 billion and bought a bunch of council members in cities and just approved a lot of housing on the properties that they purchased or something. $1 billion can do a lot of stuff, I feel like, in politics. So,
but Jeff, you're the urbanist. Like, name a city where the politics would have been any better. Like, this is the nature of, I think, development right now, is that we are really good at communicating with each other about stopping things.
Yeah.
Right. The Nextdoor app is just the worst place in the world. It's just unbelievable. And
the whole peninsula is bad, right? Like,
everything was better in 1958, right?
Yeah, that's the thing, is like when they're building all this housing, I mean, nobody's going to object. And also nobody's going to object to the greenfield development. It's not in their backyard yet, right? So
it's in no one's backyard right now. That's the rationale. At least that was, we're going to go out there and talk to a single farmer, buy all of his land, and no one's going to vote against it, essentially. That's why we have so much sprawl. But like, how to put it? I think I'm naive enough to think that there's good leadership out there that can actually navigate this. One of my friends is the mayor of Garden Grove. He's been reelected 3 times. He's termed out now. And I went to the state of the city address, his last one. And, there were thousands of people there. It was packed, and it was diverse and supportive. And I'm sure there are some people who aren't happy, but the vast majority of people seem to think that Garden Grove is better because they developed in a particular way. They found a way to add more supply, and I'm sure some of the neighborhood changed because of that. Some new people moved there, but somehow they kind of embrace change. And now they've got a better restaurant scene than they had before, and they had better public schools, and they have more public services. And like, my sense is like, this is what needs to happen, is this sort of conversation needs to evolve next into, well, if you don't want development, what do you want? And I think that in LA anyways, everyone says we want more housing, but they don't, and we actually tax ourselves to get more affordable housing. JJJ and the homelessness stuff we passed, but when someone says, well, we've raised the money now for it, well, let's spend it in your neighborhood. Someone says, no, you can't have it here because that would change something. I mean, somehow this is part of the reason we're on this path right now. And part of the reason the conversation with you is like, the conversation has to change, not into like, oh, I'm going to stop everything, because something's going to change no matter what you do. And the question is, can we help channel it in a way that's positive? I think that making good trade-offs is kind of one of the things I think Anthony and I would like to work on. Kind of be more kind of proactive about laying out what people's choices are, because the status quo has its own cost, right?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah. So if you choose to fight everything, then you're going to have other things happening to you. And so it's not free to just say no to everything.
So you finished this paper. I'm wondering where this leads you. Obviously, you mentioned you have lots of stuff in the works or lots of ideas in mind. Where does this lead you next?
Well, first, I think we want to see how these patterns extend to other cities around the country. California and Texas were probably the perfect laboratories to start trying to find these trends, and they worked out really well for that. But we've started looking at, like the largest 100 cities across the United States, and we find a lot of similar patterns, but we haven't finished that analysis yet. So that's the next one. We also want to do a version of what I said that very first presentation was that we gave, where we want to go through all the studies that have been done by the urban economists about the effects of different constraints on development, land use regulations, geography, et cetera, and see, okay, based on what's been measured, how many new units could we actually add if we made these changes? Because we're seeing places where reforms are going into place. There's new policies coming out of Sacramento, there's exciting changes in Minneapolis, and so on. But, we have a lot of studies that we could use to actually predict how many new units could be built out of this. And so far, what we've seen is it's not as many as we'd like. So if we're going to keep going down the road of thinking that these piecemeal reforms are the way to go, how much of the problem are we actually going to solve? We can measure that, and we can write a paper about that. Those are the next couple of things. And then the big picture thing is to take all this and put it together into some solutions. And we're having a lot of interesting conversations with people about that, but that's a little bit down the road.
I do think that the pendulum is swinging a bit in the favor of the YIMBY movement. There's just a general sense we need to be able to build more, and that it's gotten too easy to stop everything. But I think how you navigate that's going to be really interesting. I think that's where I'd like to sort of see the practitioner side start to play a bigger role. Is I think we know a lot about how housing markets work now. And the question is, given what we know about them, how do you actually build good policy that's equitable and fair, but ultimately constructive? I think that's just a really interesting set of questions. The city of Los Angeles right now, I think the mayor is really eager to build more housing. And I think that's terrific. The impulse is the right place. And then the question is well, how do you do that? How do you attract private capital to invest in LA and build more housing? And who gets to own it? Who gets to live there? I think those are really good questions. But again, I think the backdrop for me still is the cost of the status quo. Because if you say no to everything, and we're going to get the kind of flight we're getting in LA City right now anyways. And so there's a real pressure right now to start thinking about good, effective, balanced policy. And I'm not really sure what that means yet, but ask me again in a couple of months. I think that's kind of where I'd like to spend more time.
Well, I'd love to have you all back on to talk about the solutions, because I think that's really interesting. But I do appreciate where this is going, because like I said, it brought up a bunch of ideas in my mind. And, there's a whole bunch of other variables that we tossed onto this pile, right? Like climate change and insurance and all that stuff that makes it really interesting. So I appreciate that. Where can folks find the paper?
It's available on the Real Estate Economics website. It's also linked on my website, anthonyworlando.com. You can download a PDF in both of those places.
Awesome. I'll put it in the show notes as well. And then also, where can folks find you if you wish to be found?
After spending 40 years trying not to be found, I've started posting on LinkedIn. That's been my thing the last just a month ago. I started posting on LinkedIn, so it's been kind of fun to do that. But so I'm an amateur at this, and Anthony's got a Substack that we're going to start writing on, and so maybe that's the best way to go, because we're going to try to provide some running commentary on this going forward. That's our plan, right, Anthony?
Yep, absolutely. So anthonyorlando.substack.com.
All right.
So that's probably the best way to reach us.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
It's fun to be here, Jeff. Thank you.
It's been fun.
Thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire and appears first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our generous Patreon supporters for supporting this show and Mondays at The Overhead Wire. You can support the show by going to patreon.com/TheOverheadWire. Sign up for our 18-year-old daily newsletter by visiting TheOverheadWire.com, or check the show notes for other cool merch and opportunities to connect. Follow along using your podcatcher of choice, but if you can't find it there, you can always find the show at its original home, usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Headways.